So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Backroads, Arizona. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I built the intake system to go from the air filters to the throttle body on my LS3 crate engine that I purchased for my long travel sand rail. This video is going to contain all the materials that I used to put this together, how I put it together, and the cost it took me to put it together. Now keep in mind while you're watching this overview of how I put this together that I am a mechanic by trade that can do a little fab work here and there. So there is some mistakes that I made, and there might be some better ways to do the fab work that I did in this video. I am going to go over the mistakes that I made and what I would have done to prevent those. But overall, I am pretty happy with the end result that I came up with, and I didn't see a lot of videos like this on YouTube, so I figured this video might help you guys out to come up with an intake system or an air filter system for something you're putting together. So let's get to it. So being as though I do have a 102 millimeter throttle body on this LS3 engine, that is equivalent to a 4-inch outside diameter tubing. I purchased 3 pieces of 4-inch OD exhaust tubing that's made of mild steel because that is the easiest for me to MIG weld. One of those pieces was a 90-degree elbow. Then I also purchased a U-shaped pipe, and then I got 1 foot of just straight tubing in case I needed it. I got 95% of all the materials that I used for this project from Fodrell's Motorsports based out of Phoenix, Arizona. So basically all I ended up doing was welding the 90-degree bend to the bottom of the U-shape, and that gives me the configuration of my intake system. So during this project, I was in a time crunch because I was trying to get this car put together for dune season. So I did forget to hit the old record button when I was doing the initial cutting of the 90-degree bend to make it fit underneath the U-shaped tubing. So I'm going to give you an idea how I made this initial cut using 2 pieces of leftover tubing from the project. Basically, I took the straight piece of 4-inch pipe that I had and I set it on top of the 90-degree elbow, and I just marked around that pipe to that elbow to give me a line where I could cut it. I used a grinder with a cutoff wheel to make this cut. I also used a paddle wheel to deburr the metal and to widen it out little by little as needed. When doing the initial cut, I did go inside that mark that I had made because if I ended up being a little too small, I could always open it up a little bit more. However, if I cut it too big, then I was screwed. So basically, I would just set it on there, see what the fit was like, mark it out with a marker. I needed to grind it out a little bit more, and I repeated this process several times to get a good fit from that 90-degree elbow to the U-pipe. Once I was happy with the way it fit around the U-shaped tubing, then I set it on there and used my marker to trace around that tube to give me a nice clean mark on the U-shaped piece of pipe. Before actually cutting that mark out, I did tack weld my 90-degree bent tube onto the U-pipe so I could install it on the engine to make sure I liked the way it looked and the way it fit. Once I verified I was happy with the way it looked on the engine, I went ahead and broke off my 2 tack welds that I made on the pipe so I could go ahead and cut out around that mark to weld these 2 pieces of piping together. Once again, just like before, I just used a grinder with a cutoff wheel, and then I did finish it off using a paddle wheel to deburr it. Now here is where I did make a mistake. Unlike what I did on the 90-degree bend where I cut it smaller to start with and make sure it was going to fit correctly and I could always open it up, I decided to cut this right on the mark I had made. This ended up being the biggest mistake that I made during this project, and the reason for that is you'll notice once removing the piece of steel that I go ahead and set my 90-degree pipe in place and it contours almost identical to the U-pipe. However, there was a bunch of burrs from me cutting that in the U-pipe that I needed to remove. So I used a paddle wheel to clean those up and then a file. Once doing that, my cutout that I had done in the U-pipe ended up being a little on the big side for that 90-degree pipe, and I did have some decent sized gaps that I did have to fill in using the welder. Whereas if I would have been a little small after deburring it, I could have opened it up little by little to get a perfect fit on that pipe. Before doing a full weld around that pipe, I did tack it in place one more time and install it again to make sure everything looked good before the point of no return. Now, because I had some decent sized gaps between those 2 pieces of tubing, the welds that I did not come out nearly as good as what I would have hoped. And because of that, I did end up grinding those welds down and then filling the imperfections in using some painter's putty to give me the finished look that I was looking for after painting. Here's the painter's putty that I ended up getting from Bondo. I got it off of Amazon. It was only $6. I basically, after grinding my welds down, put a layer of that using my finger around the welds Then after it dried, I took some sandpaper and sanded it down. I ended up doing this a couple times till it got to the point where I was happy with the result. And after that, I went ahead and painted it. And here is the pictures of the end result. And keep in mind it is a little dirty on the intake tubing because I have gone to the desert a couple times since I put this project together. In order to mount the intake air temperature sensor, which is a 3/8 national pipe thread, I actually used a pipe coupler that I had and cut it in half, and then just welded it in place on the U-pipe. It's a little bit more money, but they do make weld-on bungs for this purpose. I just had that one on hand, which is why I used it. When it was all said and done, this is another thing I would have done a little differently if I had it to do over. You'll notice it's pretty out in the open, and I could have concealed it a little bit more, putting it in a different place because, let's face it, it's not that aesthetically pleasing. I got both of my air filters from Faldro Motorsports as well, along with the filter socks to go over the top of them. Here is the part number of those air filters if you are interested in getting some. They basically have a 4-inch inner diameter boot that fits perfectly around a 4-inch OD tubing. I went with paper air filters because I just have a lot more trust in those than I do in a K&N style of filter. I have had those in the past and I have gotten dirt contamination past those filters. Another thing I forgot to get a video of, guys, is I did do some spot welds on each one of the tubes where the air filters go and where the 90-degree bend elbow goes into the throttle body. I put 4 or 5 of these spot welds on each one of the tubes right at the edge to give it a little raised lip, basically. And that way, once putting the air filters on and tightening down the hose clamp, there's no possibility of those air filters slipping off of that tubing. And the same goes for the intake boot. The only thing left to do was make some support brackets to help hold that intake tubing in place. I had already made a couple brackets to hold my blow-by canisters. I actually used one for each valve cover so I can differentiate if one is producing more oil than the other. I just happen to have some miscellaneous 1/8 inch thick, 1 inch wide flat strap. So basically I held the flat strap up in place and matched the holes that I had already drilled for my canisters. Used those to support the bottom of that flat strap and then drilled one single hole in the center of the top of that strap. Then made another little tab with that same material to weld to the intake tubing. To make sure everything was going to line up perfectly, I made all the brackets, then bolted everything together hand tight, made sure it was fitting on the intake correctly. Then I covered the engine completely with welding blankets and tack welded those brackets to the intake tubing before removing them and doing a final weld all the way around. And that way, if I need to remove that intake system for whatever reason, it's just a matter of removing 2 bolts and then the clamps on the boots connecting the tubing to the throttle body. And keep in mind, while I was welding this, it was still in the fabrication stage, and I had just installed the engine, so I had no gasoline in the system whatsoever. So it was safe in order to do this. So that's going to pretty much wrap it up for this video, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it and it gave you some good information. There's going to be a lot more videos to come with this car and this build. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.